Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, and thanks for joining us here on the network. Right now, we have a lot to cover, what's on the agenda for today, so let's get started right now. Okay, lot to consider here, lot to think about with what the prosecution just said. So let's get some perspective, and I'm so happy our next guest is joining us, Law and Crime trial analyst Elura Nanos. Elura, it's great to have you. I just wish you were here in studio with me.
I know, Jesse. I promise I will get in there soon, but thank you for ever the warm welcome.
Of course. So I haven't had a chance to talk to you about the Charles Merritt case. What do you make of it?
Well, you know, I'll tell you, I think that this prosecutor has his hands full. And the reason I say that is because when you have a case like this where, you know, the facts are truly horrific, you know, you hear about, my gosh, an entire family murdered and murdered so violently and then, you know, hidden far from their home. The first thing I think that comes to mind is that the person who did it, whoever that person may be, must have really hated this family to the point of needing to be so violent and so horrific. But the motive that we have here is a financial motive, which seems sort of in some ways to not logically fit such brutal facts. That's not to say that finances could not be a motive or that this defendant is not guilty, but I think it is a jump that the prosecutor is going to have to guide this jury through.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because a lot of times people look at this case and say, hey, you know, killing for only a few $1,000s. The flip side of that is we've seen people kill for a lot less. And the other side of it is that not only have people killed for a lot less, if you put yourself in the shoes of Charles Merritt, perhaps that money meant so much to him. Put yourself in his position, who was in financial distress, had a gambling problem, was in debt. Maybe that's an incentive. But I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, let's listen to what the defense had to say in their opening statement, trying to raise some reasonable doubt. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everybody. We're talking about the Charles Merritt case. We're going to be back live in that courtroom on Wednesday. Really huge case we're covering here. Going to last several months. A bit complicated, the story put forward, but an important case nonetheless. You have this whole family who was killed and found. Their remains were found in the Mojave Desert back in 2013. They were missing for 3 years. Charles Merritt is now on trial for the murder of this family. He was a business associate of the father, Joseph McStay, and it's alleged he killed Joseph and his whole family for financial gain. That particularly, I would say, in the days after, or the time after the McStays disappeared, he was writing himself checks, allegedly writing himself checks, from Joseph McStay's QuickBooks account. And even before Joseph had disappeared, he was manipulating those accounts for his own benefit. So the idea that he had a financial motive here is really strong. And what we were just listening to from the prosecution's opening statement is how these bodies were found in the Mojave Desert and who had the opportunity and resources to make this happen. They're pointing the finger at the defendant. But what did the defense say in their opening statement? Let's see.
Fallbrook House. Now, there's two theories that you could present for that. Immediate disposal. He took them out on the time he killed them on the 4th. Well, if he immediately disposed of the bodies, that means he would have kept them in the back of his truck for 2 days. Problem is, there's no blood in his truck. Now, we know blood spatter would be all over the assailant from crushing those heads with a sledgehammer. Blood would have dripped out of the back of the truck when you're driving around for 2 days. Because he drove all over, blood will move. Her sweatpants and panties were not found on her body. They were pulled off together, intermixed. You know how you kind of pull them off and the legs kind of start coming through? That's how they were found next to her head in the grave site. The bra strap and the left cup were inside the grave with her. The right cup was found outside. And between the two, it was cut. Either knife, scissors, say knife. And painter's tape was found in the grave from the house. Evidence can show that's probably a way they got her out of the house, controlled her that way by putting tape around her. Even Sergeant Ryan Smith, who's seated here, in his DNA analysis request form said, we believe Summer was raped before she was murdered.
Laura, what I'm seeming to be guessing from the defense's opening statement is they're saying this doesn't seem to be consistent that Charles Merritt would have done this, and that let alone anybody like him who had this financial motive, when there seemed to be evidence that, I mean, the body of the father is different from the rest of the family. Something doesn't add up. What did you think of their opening statement?
So, on one hand, I do think that those facts are very important. And look, the defense has to work with the facts that exist. And here, excuse me, that is an important set of facts, that what happened to one victim is different than what happened to the other victim. So that is really important. But the thing that I'm not loving about this defense opening statement is that this guy is talking at length about all the gruesome details of this crime. And if I didn't know that this was the defense opening statement, I would think it's the prosecution's opening statement. So I think interwoven in there, through every statement he makes, or at least every few statements he makes, he's got to say something about how these things don't implicate his client. And I'm not hearing enough of that. These jurors are going to want justice for this family. This is such a horrific crime. And I really want more information here about, even just this guy's argument about why these factors mean it's not his client. And I'm not hearing enough of it.
Maybe they're showing how gruesome it is and say, well, look, you want answers, jury. We might have an answer for you. It's a different guy, a man named Dan Kavanaugh. We have the person who did this, or at least the person who investigators didn't thoroughly look at. And once they're handed the case, maybe that's why they're going into such detail, because they're saying we can't deny it happened, but we can try to point the finger at somebody else. And I'll tell you what we're going to do. We're going to talk about the different theories put down in this case. And one of them was that the McStays had fled to Mexico. Let's take a break, and when we come back, we're going to hear some testimony about that. Stay tuned. Okay, Elura, now, again, a family just doesn't pick up and disappear, and wind up in the Mojave Desert. There has to have been a connection there. This Mexico theory, it's going to be ultimately up to the jury to determine whether or not this is believable, correct?
Absolutely. That's a question of fact. It will be 100% up to the jury. I think the evidence that the brother gave is going to be compelling to say, that not only did he not believe it's within general character for them to pick up and take these children to Mexico, but that Summer actually had said that she was fearful of Mexico prior to this event, and that he had specific reason to believe that she wouldn't take them there. That's going to be difficult to get around.
Well, the idea that people are so hung up on this one is because of the nature of the crime. If a sledgehammer was in fact used, and she was in fact perhaps sexually assaulted before the killing, and the lower half of Joseph McStay's body is missing, and this family is buried in the Mojave Desert, this is sometimes has been seen as characteristic of cartel killings, even though this theory has been ruled out by investigators.
Yeah, I think that the Mexico, just the whole Mexico thing, Mexico as kind of this looming potential theme for this, can be really important, because this is such a violent crime that, I think that the average juror on the street might be really more willing to accept that this was a drug-related cartel-style killing. And that could be a very credible, theory for the case, perhaps more credible than the fact that someone who is a thief and an embezzler then becomes a violent rapist and murderer.
Well, here's the thing. The more the prosecution can show that the killings happened in the house, the greater the case against Charles Merritt. And there's certain parts of the evidence found at the crime scene that shows it might have happened in the house.
Absolutely. And I think that this in the house versus not in the house, you think that there's going to have to be some way to explain around why that evidence that could have been in the house was missing. Why isn't there any blood? Why isn't there any sign of that kind of struggle? But you're right. I think that's going to be critical for the jury to decide, where did this happen, and then what makes sense, in terms of who is the culprit, based on who had the access and who had the proximity to wherever the crime scene actually was.
Right, and the idea that the paint on the sledgehammer and certain articles that were found at the gravesite, I mean, the McStays, they were painting in their house at the time of their disappearance. That's a huge fact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's not necessarily the only explanation for that, but I do think that that is going to be that's going to be critical. And I think that the more we see any evidence pointing to the location being in that house, the more likely we're going to at least narrow it down to the defendant and the man that the defense is trying to point the finger to, Kavanaugh, and away from something else like a Mexican cartel.
Yeah, and the idea is like these facts can go both ways. You talk about why there's no blood in the house. Well, maybe there was blood in the house. We're showing something on the dining room table, but one witness said it wasn't blood, and he doesn't think that it could have been the killings happened in the house. But then again, maybe it is blood. And there's so much to back and forth, and we're going to talk more about this when we discuss the medical examiner's findings right after the next break and give us more insight into what happened to this family of four. We'll be right back. Okay, let's talk about this. Let's discuss a little bit more of what we just heard. Elura, how is the defense doing at raising this reasonable doubt that the killings really didn't happen the way the prosecution said?
Well, I mean, I think that the defense is certainly making some points. Will it amount to reasonable doubt about that particular aspect? I don't know yet. But I do think that the defense is scoring some points here.
Now, I want to talk about the bodies that were found in the Mojave Desert, this gravesite. John Bluth, okay, regular guy, no connection to this case. He discovered the bodies in the Mojave Desert. We have his 911 phone call. Let's listen to it right now.
I'm out here on a motorcycle out behind the dump, and I found what looks like a human skull.
Can you give me a location?
Yes. Okay. West of the 15 and north of the stockpile where the dump is. Maybe I should just call the local sheriff and tell them where on a map, because it's on dirt roads.
I understand, but I'm just looking for a starting point. And this is the local sheriff.
Oh, okay. Starting point. Start at the 15 north Stutterwell exit.
Okay. Let's see, is it over by the landfill?
Yes. It's within, I'd say, about a half mile of that landfill. It's directly to the south of me.
Okay, so from the landfill, where are you?
Due north, approximately, I'd say a good 2,000 feet.
Okay. Did you find it in the landfill or just in a field out there near it?
In a field.
Just a gruesome killing, and we're trying to understand how it all went down. Elura, the idea that the defense is saying that this other suspect, Dan Kavanaugh, did this, again, they're saying he had a financial motive and he had reason to kill the family. Again, somebody else who had a financial motive and a business associate would commit such a heinous, gruesome crime. Does that make sense to you?
I mean, it could, but I certainly would have to know a little bit more about either one of these potential murderers. I mean, generally, the fact that someone maybe is committing a financial crime is not in and of itself evidence that that person did or could even commit a violent crime. It certainly doesn't preclude them, but, I mean, it is somewhat of a leap to make that just because someone had a financial motive that they would, carry out this gruesome murder of not just the business owner, but his wife and two very small children. It just seems like sort of a lot to build into the fact of a financial motive. Okay,
so let's just talk about Charles Merritt. If the prosecution can successfully show to the jury that A, he embezzled the funds, that B, his cell phone pinged in the area where the bodies were found, pinged right after they had disappeared, if they can show those really were his tire tracks, if they can show that he had a distaste for Summer McStay and maybe even the boys based upon his police interview, and that, he was being deceptive afterwards, is that enough to show that, and his behavior after they disappeared in general, in terms of going to the house, is that enough to convict him?
I think it certainly can be, and I think that you hit on some really important points there, Jesse, because the cell phone pinging in the area where the bodies were, to me, is a big deal. And so is evidence of tire tracks or anything putting him physically in that location. That, I think, is a really big deal. And when you have a crime like this that is so sad, especially, there are child victims, there's potential rape going on in this trial. When you have something like that, the jurors, they're going to want to find someone to blame. So we may have a situation where if the facts basically make sense, and they can string them together in some way that is logical, that the jury will find that this is enough to convict.
You think what does the defense need to do when they ultimately get the case, and who knows how long that might be? We think this trial might last several months.
I think that one of the most important things that the defense needs to do is to take this other potential suspect, this Kavanaugh guy, and find some evidence of him having violent history. I think that if you throw violence into it somehow, and you show we have two guys with potential financial motives, one of them has a violent history and one of them doesn't, to me, that's going to be really important in terms of reasonable doubt.
Unfortunately for the defense, there was a series of communications showing this, and it's not allowed in, which is such a shame for the defense. And we could talk about that a little bit later on. But unfortunately, Elura, I'm signing off. But you stick around, because Bob Bianchi's coming in, and he's going to guide everybody through the next chapter of the cases we're covering here on Law and Crime. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.